Mid-1943. Across the United States, shipyards work around the clock. In Washington, D.C., officials in the Navy Department review production reports. The emergency shipbuilding program has hit its stride. Steel flows from factories in Pittsburgh and Chicago to coastal yards in California, Virginia, and New York. The workers are young men deferred from the draft, women who left homes and farms, and older men who came back to work for the war effort. The assembly lines for ships run like those for cars. Welding crews fit steel plates. Riveters seal hulls. Cranes swing massive sections into place. The smell of hot metal fills the air. The United States needs carriers, and it needs them fast. The fleet carriers like Enterprise and Saratoga are powerful, but they take too long to build. The Navy decides to create a smaller class of ship, the Escort carrier, nicknamed the Baby Flattop. These ships are not meant to fight enemy fleets directly. They will protect convoys from submarines, carry planes for amphibious landings, and support troops ashore. They are built on merchant ship hulls, using existing commercial ship designs. This allows shipyards that have never built warships to join the effort. By the summer of 1943, the first of these carriers begin to slide into the water. They measure about 500 feet in length and carry around 30 planes, fighters, torpedo bombers, and anti-submarine aircraft. They are slower than fleet carriers, only about 19 knots, but they are good enough for their mission. Most importantly, they can be built fast. Some are completed in less than 3 months from keel to commissioning. As American production surges, Japanese naval intelligence takes notice. Reports arrive in Tokyo describing new U.S. carriers appearing across the Pacific. At first, Japanese officers dismiss them as exaggerations. But soon, the evidence is clear. Intercepted communications confirm the U.S. is launching escort carriers at an incredible rate. By the end of 1943, dozens are already in service. The total will eventually reach 122. Inside the headquarters of the Imperial Japanese Navy, admirals gather around maps of the Pacific. They study the reports with grim faces. Until now, Japan has relied on its powerful fleet carriers like Shokaku and Zuikaku. These ships helped win victories early in the war, but replacing them has been slow and costly. Japan has limited shipyard capacity and fewer resources. Aircraft losses have been heavy, and trained pilots are scarce. The realization spreads through the room. The United States can now replace every lost ship many times over. Even if Japan wins a battle at sea, America will return with more carriers and more planes. For the Japanese admirals, it feels like the moment when the war turns. One officer quietly remarks that no strategy can overcome this imbalance. While this intelligence reaches Tokyo, the carriers themselves begin to shape the fighting on the front lines. In the Central Pacific, American forces prepare to take Tarawa in November 1943. Escort carriers form part of the invasion fleet. Their aircraft fly constant patrols over the landing beaches. They hunt Japanese submarines lurking in the sea lanes. They provide close air support to the Marines storming the atoll. The pattern repeats across the islands. At Saipan in June 1944, escort carriers are everywhere. Their planes strike enemy positions, protect transports, and guard supply convoys. Japanese commanders see carriers appearing even in areas far from the main fleet. It seems to them as if the Americans have an endless number of ships. The technical advantage of the escort carriers lies not only in their numbers but also in their flexibility. Each ship is small enough to operate from smaller ports and anchorages. Groups of 3 or 4 can move with convoys or accompany amphibious task forces. They free up the big fleet carriers to focus on major battles. At the same time, their aircraft give the U.S. a constant presence over wide areas of ocean. Japanese submarines, once a threat to American shipping, now face a deadly enemy. The escort carriers launch hunter-killer groups. Aircraft spot periscopes and oil slicks, then drop depth charges. Destroyer escorts move in for the kill. The U.S. submarine force has already been sinking Japanese merchant ships at a high rate. Now, Japanese subs are being destroyed before they can even attack. For American sailors, life aboard an escort carrier is different from the fleet carriers. The decks are crowded and cramped. The flight deck is smaller, making takeoffs and landings more dangerous. Many of the crew are young and inexperienced. For some, this is their first time at sea. They work long hours under the sun, maintaining aircraft and preparing for constant flight operations. When battle comes, the reality of war strikes hard. In October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, several escort carriers find themselves directly attacked by a Japanese surface fleet. At Samar, small escort carriers and their escorts face battleships and heavy cruisers. Pilots launch with bombs and torpedoes to fight back. Gunners fire until their barrels overheat. Ships are hit, burning, sinking. Against overwhelming odds, they hold the line. Japanese commanders expect an easy victory, but they encounter fierce resistance. News of these clashes reaches Tokyo. The admirals already know they are outnumbered, but now they see how even the smallest American carriers can fight effectively. Every week, more escort carriers leave American shipyards. By early 1944, Japanese leaders understand that their navy cannot recover. They lack the steel, the oil, the trained crews, and above all, the time. The escort carriers symbolize a larger truth. This war is not just fought at sea or in the skies. It is fought in factories, shipyards, and supply lines. America's industrial capacity becomes its greatest weapon. As the numbers grow, the Japanese fleet grows smaller and weaker. The outcome of the Pacific War begins to take shape, one new carrier at a time. The escort carrier was born out of need. In 1942 and early 1943, the United States Navy faced a shortage of carriers. Fleet carriers like Enterprise, Yorktown, and Saratoga were powerful but took too long to build. Each required specialized shipyards, extensive resources, and highly trained crews. The Pacific War was spreading across thousands of miles, and America needed a way to project air power quickly and in many places at once. The solution was a smaller, simpler carrier that could be built in far greater numbers. Designers turned to the merchant ship hull as their starting point. Commercial hulls were already being produced in huge numbers for cargo ships and tankers. By adapting these hulls, the Navy could speed construction and use shipyards that had never built warships before. Instead of waiting years for a single fleet carrier, they could produce multiple escort carriers in the same time. These ships were officially designated CVE, or Carrier Vessel Escort. Sailors called them baby flat tops. A typical escort carrier measured just over 500 feet from bow to stern and displaced about 10,000 tons. The flight deck was shorter and narrower than that of a fleet carrier, and there was only one small elevator to move aircraft between the hangar deck and the flight deck. A single, modest island structure held the bridge and control tower. Unlike the big carriers, these ships carried no heavy armor and had only limited anti-aircraft guns for defense. Speed was low, usually around 19 knots, just fast enough to keep up with convoys and amphibious groups. What made these carriers effective was their aircraft. Each could carry between 24 and 30 planes, a mix of fighters like the F-4F Wildcat and later the FM-2 version, along with torpedo bombers such as the TBF Avenger. These aircraft could scout ahead, attack submarines, strike enemy positions on shore, and defend against enemy planes. The air group was small, but even a handful of planes could make a critical difference for convoys traveling through dangerous waters. Construction speed was the key advantage. At the height of production, some escort carriers went from laying the keel to launching in less than 3 months. This speed was possible because the Navy used prefabricated sections and assembly line methods similar to those used in automobile factories. Civilian workers, many of them women entering the industrial workforce for the first time, learned to weld, rivet, and assemble ships in record time. Shipyards along the Gulf Coast, the East Coast, and the West Coast all contributed. Henry Kaiser's shipyards, already famous for producing Liberty ships, became leaders in escort carrier construction as well. By mid-1943, new escort carriers were rolling off the ways in a steady stream. Each was named after a bay or sound, reflecting their role as support vessels rather than capital ships. Crews moved aboard even before construction was finished, training to operate the flight deck, the engines, and the weapons. These carriers were simple, but they were reliable. Once completed, they sailed immediately to the Pacific or the Atlantic to join the fight. The United States built 122 of these escort carriers over the course of the war. This massive number meant that losses, when they occurred, were quickly replaced. A ship sunk in battle could be replaced by another already fitting out at a shipyard. The Navy could even increase the total number of carriers in service each month. This production capacity gave U.S. commanders a freedom of action the Japanese could not match. In contrast, Japanese shipbuilding struggled. The Imperial Japanese Navy relied on traditional methods and limited industrial capacity. Each fleet carrier required specialized steel, heavy armor, and complex machinery. Only a few shipyards in Japan were capable of producing them, and they were also busy repairing damaged ships and building other vital vessels like battleships and cruisers. By late 1943, Japan could launch only a handful of carriers in an entire year, and these were often light carriers with reduced capabilities. The pace of American production outstripped Japan's by a wide margin. Even when the Japanese achieved tactical success, such as sinking a U.S. carrier, the victory was temporary. The Americans would have a replacement ready within weeks. The impact on operations was immediate. Convoys carrying troops, fuel, and supplies to forward bases now sailed with escort carriers guarding them. The presence of carrier-based aircraft deterred Japanese submarines and provided early warning against air attacks. When American forces staged amphibious assaults on islands like Tarawa, Kwajalein, and Saipan, escort carriers provided close air support. Their planes struck enemy bunkers, artillery positions, and supply dumps, softening defenses before the troops went ashore. This dual role, protection at sea and support on land, made escort carriers a cornerstone of the island-hopping strategy. Fleet carriers could focus on engaging the main Japanese fleet and striking distant targets, while the smaller carriers handled the constant day-to-day tasks that kept the advance moving. The Japanese soon noticed the change. Naval intelligence reports from late 1943 describe increasing numbers of U.S. carriers appearing across the Pacific. At first, the Japanese believed these were fleet carriers, but reconnaissance flights revealed many were smaller vessels. Even so, the numbers were alarming. Entire task groups of 3 or 4 escort carriers, accompanied by destroyer escorts and transports, operated in areas where Japan had once held control. Japanese submarine crews reported being hunted relentlessly. American planes circled overhead, forcing submarines to remain submerged for long periods. When a periscope was spotted, aircraft swooped in with depth charges and rockets. Destroyer escorts followed up with sonar and more depth charges. Losses mounted, and Japan's submarine campaign faltered. The disparity in shipbuilding output became a strategic problem the Japanese could not solve. Their admirals understood that even perfect tactics would fail against overwhelming numbers. Each time a Japanese carrier was sunk, it represented years of effort lost. Each time an American carrier was sunk, another waited to take its place. By early 1944, American production lines were still running at full speed. Escort carriers kept flowing into the fleet. For every operation in the Central Pacific, there were more ships available than planners had expected. Japanese naval leaders watched as the balance of power shifted irreversibly. The escort carriers, built quickly and in great numbers, had turned the tide of the Pacific War long before the final battles were fought. The war in the Pacific stretches across thousands of miles of ocean. By late 1943, American supply lines run from the west coast of the United States to forward bases in the Central Pacific. These lifelines carry troops, fuel, ammunition, and food. Japanese submarines wait along these routes. Their mission is simple: cut the flow of supplies and slow the American advance. At first, they succeed. A single well-placed torpedo can sink a transport loaded with men and equipment. Each loss threatens operations at the front. The escort carriers arrive just in time. They form hunter-killer groups with destroyer escorts. A typical group consists of 1 or 2 carriers and several fast escorts. The carriers launch aircraft that search for enemy submarines. When a plane spots a periscope or an oil slick, it radios the position. Depth charges fall from the sky. Rockets tear into the water. The destroyer escorts move in to finish the job with sonar and more depth charges. The hunters soon become the hunted. Japanese submarine crews find it harder and harder to get close to their targets. They spend long hours submerged, batteries running low, crews exhausted. Every attempt to attack ends with the same result. Planes appear overhead, forcing them to dive deep, followed by explosions as destroyers close in. By early 1944, the U.S. has shifted from defense to offense. The island-hopping campaign begins in earnest. The first major test for the escort carriers comes at Tarawa in November 1943. The atoll is ringed with coral reefs and fortified by Japanese troops. Before the Marines can land, they need air cover. The fleet carriers strike the outer defenses, while the escort carriers take position close to the beaches. Their aircraft fly continuous missions, bombing gun emplacements and strafing defenders. When landing craft run aground on the reefs, pilots from the escort carriers attack enemy positions to protect the stranded Marines. The battle is brutal. Casualties are high. But without the constant support of the escort carriers, the landing might have failed. Their smaller air groups stay overhead even when the big carriers move on to other targets. Tarawa proves that the baby flat-tops can deliver steady, close-range firepower for extended operations. As the campaign moves forward, the scale grows. At Saipan in June 1944, dozens of escort carriers operate alongside the main fleet. Their role is to protect the transports and provide round-the-clock support for troops fighting inland. Japanese aircraft attempt to strike the invasion fleet, but the presence of so many carriers makes it nearly impossible. Fighter planes launch at the first sign of enemy activity. Transports continue to unload men and supplies without serious disruption. While American forces advance, Japanese commanders struggle to understand the scope of the threat. Reports come in from scattered bases across the Pacific. Patrols describe enemy carriers appearing where none were expected. Some reports seem exaggerated. Others conflict. The sheer number of sightings creates confusion. Admirals in Tokyo spread maps across their tables, trying to track movements. One report stands out. A reconnaissance flight over the Marianas counts more than 20 carriers. The officer delivering the report clarifies that many are smaller vessels. Even so, the numbers are staggering. The Japanese realize that what they considered secondary carriers now outnumber their own fleet carriers. A senior admiral studies the map in silence. Finally, he admits to his staff that Japan cannot match this level of production. Even if they win one decisive battle, the Americans will simply return with more ships. The reality of this imbalance becomes clear in October 1944 at Leyte Gulf. The Japanese launch a desperate operation to stop the American invasion of the Philippines. Their plan is complex, involving several fleets converging on Leyte to attack the landing forces. One group, led by powerful battleships and heavy cruisers, slips through the San Bernardino Strait and heads for the vulnerable transport ships. In their path are only a few escort carriers and their small escorts. These ships belong to a formation known as Taffy 3. At dawn on October 25th, lookouts spot the Japanese fleet on the horizon. The situation is dire. The escort carriers have no heavy guns and carry only light aircraft. Their destroyer escorts are small and lightly armed. Retreat seems the only option, but turning away would leave the invasion force defenseless. The order goes out to launch every plane. Pilots take off without full loads of bombs or torpedoes. Some carry nothing but machine guns and fuel. They attack anyway, diving through heavy anti-aircraft fire to strike the enemy ships. Destroyer escorts charge forward, laying smoke screens and launching torpedoes. The battle becomes chaotic. Japanese ships fire their massive guns at point-blank range. Shells crash through decks and superstructures. Escort carriers burn, some sinking beneath the waves. Yet the Americans fight with determination. The constant air attacks and aggressive torpedo runs confuse the Japanese commanders. They begin to overestimate the strength of the force they are facing. Finally, the Japanese fleet turns away. The retreat spares the transports and secures the beachhead. The cost is high. Several escort carriers and destroyers are lost, and many sailors and pilots are killed. But the courage of Taffy 3 prevents disaster. News of the battle spreads quickly. In Tokyo, senior officers read the reports with disbelief. They had expected an easy victory over a few small carriers. Instead, their fleet was driven back. The lesson is clear. The Americans have so many carriers that even their smallest ships can stand in the way of Japan's main battle fleet. By late 1944, Japanese intelligence struggles to keep pace. Reports come from every sector of the Pacific. Escort carriers seem to be everywhere at once, supporting landings, guarding convoys, hunting submarines. The enemy's presence is constant. The Japanese admirals see the pattern forming. Their navy is shrinking with each battle, while the Americans continue to grow stronger. In the war rooms of Tokyo, the maps no longer show a balance of power. Instead, they show a rising tide of American carriers, too many to count, moving ever closer to the heart of Japan. In Tokyo, the air inside the naval headquarters grows heavy. Reports arrive one after another. Each one confirms what the admirals already suspect. American carriers appear at every landing, every convoy route, every stretch of ocean where Japan once held control. The younger officers whisper among themselves, trying to hide their unease. The older men sit in silence. Maps are spread across long tables, covered with markers showing enemy movements. There are too many markers now. No plan can cover them all. A senior admiral stands at the head of the room. His face is drawn, his voice quiet. He knows what these reports mean. Courage and skill will not change the outcome. Japan's pilots are brave, and their ships are well handled, but numbers decide battles as much as tactics. The United States is building carriers faster than Japan can sink them. Even a flawless victory today will be erased by new American ships tomorrow. Someone mentions Yamamoto's warning from before the war. He had studied in the United States and understood its industrial strength. He had told the government that a quick war might be won, but a long war would be lost. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant," he had said. Now, with the reports on the table, those words seem prophetic. Yamamoto is gone, killed in 1943 when his plane was shot down. But his warning remains in every mind in the room. Outside the headquarters, Tokyo shows signs of strain. Civilians line up for rice and vegetables. Rations grow smaller each month. Factories run short of steel and oil. Workers repair damaged ships with whatever material they can find. Bombers appear over the city more often now. Each raid leaves more fires and ruins. The people feel the war closing in. On the other side of the Pacific, life aboard the escort carriers is a world apart. The ships are crowded and noisy. Young men, many barely out of high school, live and work in tight quarters. They sleep in bunks stacked 3 high. The air smells of oil, sweat, and salt. On the flight deck, the wind never stops. Pilots and deck crews move with purpose, their eyes sharp for danger. Every landing is a test. The flight deck is short, and mistakes can be fatal. Many of these sailors and pilots are in combat for the first time. Some are terrified. Others hide their fear behind jokes and laughter. When the alarm sounds, they rush to their stations. They do what they were trained to do even when their hands shake. At night, they write letters home by the light of a single bulb, telling their families as little as possible about the danger they face. During the battle off Samar, fear turns to sheer willpower. As Japanese battleships and cruisers bear down on their small group, the crews of the escort carriers know they cannot outrun or outgun the enemy. Yet they launch every plane they have. Pilots take off with whatever weapons are ready, sometimes only machine guns. They attack again and again, knowing they might not return. On deck, gunners aim at incoming shells and aircraft. Smoke fills the air. Men work through exhaustion, dragging the wounded to safety, fighting fires, patching holes in the deck. Some ships are hit and burning. Others vanish beneath the waves. Even so, they keep fighting. The battle is chaos, but it is also courage made visible. Survivors later speak of moments that stay with them. A pilot remembers diving on a cruiser, watching his torpedo hit, then pulling up through a storm of flak. A deck crewman recalls the heat of the fires and the screams of the wounded. A destroyer captain describes turning his small ship directly at a line of battleships, launching torpedoes at point-blank range, then watching the massive enemy ships turn away. News of Samar spreads quickly across the fleet. The men aboard other escort carriers feel pride. They see what their ships and crews can do when pushed to the limit. For many, it becomes a defining moment. These were not the Navy's biggest or most powerful ships, but they stood their ground against overwhelming force. Back home, families wait for news. In shipyards across America, women and men continue to work day and night. They know some of the ships they launch will never return. Still, they keep building. A mother riveting steel plates may have a son aboard one of the carriers. A father working the night shift at a factory may have a daughter flying with a transport squadron. The connection between home and front is direct and deeply felt. The Rosie the Riveter campaign is more than posters and slogans. It is real people doing difficult work. Welding crews labor in the heat and noise, creating the ships that sail to war. Assembly lines produce engines, guns, and aircraft. Each finished part represents hours of effort and a hope for victory. In Japan, the contrast is stark. Families face shortages of food and clothing. Bombing raids destroy neighborhoods. Children are evacuated to the countryside. Civilians dig shelters and fight fires with buckets of water. Factories struggle to keep up with military demands. Workers know the Navy needs more ships and planes, but they also know there are not enough materials or trained workers to meet those needs. As the war grinds on, the mood darkens. The Japanese public hears of victories less often. The losses are harder to hide. Civilians whisper their fears as they stand in ration lines. In the naval headquarters, officers speak carefully, aware that bad news must be delivered with care. Every new American landing brings another wave of despair. The admirals study the reports in silence, understanding that each island taken brings the enemy closer to Japan itself. They look at the growing list of American carriers, a list that seems to have no end. They see the names of their own ships crossed out, lost in battle, never to be replaced. The human cost is felt on every side. In the cabins of the escort carriers, young sailors try to sleep despite the rumble of engines and the memory of battle. In Tokyo, families search for missing relatives after each bombing raid. In American shipyards, workers push themselves to build more ships, knowing that speed matters. Everywhere, the war leaves its mark, shaping lives through fear, courage, loss, and relentless effort. The Pacific War is a war of distance. Every island captured must be supplied with food, fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements. Without secure sea lanes, an invasion cannot hold. Early in the war, Japanese submarines struck at these lines with success. They sank transports and cargo ships, forcing the United States to divert resources to convoy protection. Each sinking slowed the American advance. For a time, Japan hoped that constant attrition would break the enemy's momentum. The arrival of the escort carriers changes this balance. These small ships travel with the convoys, their aircraft always overhead. When a submarine approaches, patrol planes circle and strike. The destroyer escorts that sail alongside them attack with sonar and depth charges. The once dangerous submarine threat begins to fade. By mid-1944, the Japanese undersea campaign has failed. American convoys move steadily forward, delivering everything needed for new offensives. Supplies now reach even the most remote forward bases. This freedom of movement allows American forces to launch a strategy of leapfrogging across the Pacific. Planners select key islands, bypass others, and move closer and closer to Japan. Escort carriers form a constant shield during these operations. They do not engage in dramatic fleet battles. Instead, they perform the steady, essential work of protecting transports and providing close air support for troops ashore. The rhythm of invasion becomes predictable. First, the fleet carriers strike the target from a distance. Then the escort carriers take over, staying behind to guard and sustain the beachhead. At Kwajalein, Eniwetok, Saipan, and Guam, this pattern repeats. Each victory builds a chain of bases stretching westward. Japanese garrisons on bypassed islands are left isolated, unable to resupply or escape. The escort carriers make this possible. Without them, the convoys would be vulnerable and the landings exposed to counterattack. With them, the advance never pauses. The Japanese Navy, once the most powerful in the Pacific, begins to collapse under the strain. Losses cannot be replaced. Every carrier sunk is gone forever. Every cruiser or destroyer damaged takes months to repair, if it can be repaired at all. Fuel shortages limit operations. By late 1944, Japanese ships often sail with only partial loads of ammunition and fuel, making it impossible to conduct prolonged battles. The climax comes at Leyte Gulf in October 1944. This is Japan's last chance to strike a decisive blow. They assemble every available ship for a massive effort to destroy the American landing force in the Philippines. The battle is vast, involving hundreds of ships across several days. For a brief moment, Japanese tactics create a dangerous situation when their center force slips through the San Bernardino Strait and approaches the vulnerable escort carriers and transports off Samar. The fighting that follows is desperate. The escort carriers of Taffy 3 and their escorts fight with everything they have, launching continuous air attacks and charging with torpedoes. Their resistance buys time. Confused by the ferocity of the defense and concerned about losses, the Japanese admiral orders a retreat. The opportunity to destroy the landing force slips away. When the battle ends, the scale of the disaster for Japan becomes clear. They lose 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. More important than the numbers is the reality. Japan's navy has ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. After Leyte Gulf, there will be no more major Japanese fleet actions. The surviving ships remain in port, lacking fuel and crews. The Americans now control the sea completely. From this point forward, the war is one-sided. Escort carriers roam the Pacific freely, supporting operations without fear of challenge. They guard supply lines and continue to protect amphibious assaults. Each new landing brings American forces closer to Japan itself. The escort carriers, though small, are present at every step. Their constant presence ensures that no counterattack can disrupt the advance. The shift is more than tactical. It represents a fundamental change in naval warfare. Before the war, battleships were seen as the core of a navy. Japan built its fleet around these massive ships. Even their carriers were intended to support the battleships. But the war proves that aircraft, not heavy guns, decide battles. At Leyte Gulf, Japanese battleships face American planes and cannot win. The escort carriers, with their small air groups, demonstrate that even modest air power is deadly when used in large numbers and coordinated with surface ships. This change comes from more than strategy. It comes from industry. The United States can build ships, planes, and weapons on a scale no other nation can match. The escort carriers are proof of this strength. Each one is the product of a network of factories, steel mills, and shipyards. Workers produce engines in Detroit, guns in Pennsylvania, and aircraft in California. Components travel by rail to the coasts, where shipyards assemble them into fighting ships. The process never stops. As one carrier launches, another begins construction. For Japan, the contrast is devastating. Their factories struggle under constant bombing. Materials are scarce. Oil shipments from the southern resource areas are sunk by American submarines before they reach home. Shipbuilding slows to a crawl. Even when a new carrier is launched, there may not be enough planes or pilots to equip it. The psychological effect is as powerful as the material one. American commanders can plan operations with confidence, knowing replacements are always on the way. If a carrier is lost in battle, another will soon take its place. Japanese commanders plan with the opposite knowledge. Every loss is permanent. Each decision must weigh the risk of losing irreplaceable ships. As the Americans press forward, the pattern becomes inevitable. The escort carriers secure the sea lanes, the fleet carriers strike ahead, and the ground forces move from island to island. Japan can no longer mount offensive operations. Without fuel or supply, their navy cannot leave port. Even their air forces weaken, starved of planes and trained pilots. By early 1945, the Pacific is an American ocean. The escort carriers, once considered a stopgap measure, are everywhere. They hunt submarines, cover landings, and keep the supply lines open. Their success shows that war is not won only by the clash of fleets but by the steady, relentless application of industrial power. The factories of America, linked to the decks of these small carriers, have reshaped the balance of the Pacific and sealed the fate of the Japanese Navy. The war ends and the oceans grow quiet. Ships return to port, many worn down by years of constant action. Among them are the escort carriers, the small, sturdy ships that had been everywhere during the Pacific campaign. Their decks are scarred, their hulls dented, their paint faded from sun and salt. Some are scrapped soon after the war, their usefulness ended in peacetime. Others remain for a few more years, serving as training ships or aircraft ferries. For the men who served on them, each ship holds memories of long nights at sea, sudden battles, and narrow escapes. Over time, the 122 escort carriers come to represent something larger than their individual stories. They become a symbol of what the United States accomplished in the war. Each one was built quickly, often in less than 3 months, using the resources of a nation that had turned its entire industrial base toward victory. The carriers were proof that a country could fight a global war not only with armies and fleets, but with factories, shipyards, and assembly lines. Naval planners around the world take notice. Before the war, battleships had been seen as the heart of a navy. The Japanese Navy had been built around them, and even the U.S. Navy had entered the war with a mindset shaped by battleship doctrine. The escort carriers helped change that thinking. Though small and lightly armed, their sheer numbers and constant presence show that air power, even on a modest scale, can control vast areas of ocean. They prove that a carrier does not need to be large or powerful to be decisive when combined with others and supported by logistics. The experience of the escort carriers also teaches a lesson about production. Japan fought with skill and bravery, but its limited industrial base meant every loss was final. A carrier sunk could not be replaced quickly. A squadron of trained pilots lost in battle could not be rebuilt in time for the next fight. The United States, by contrast, could replace ships and crews faster than they were destroyed. This ability to absorb losses and continue fighting turned the tide of the war long before the final battles. Future military planners study these lessons. They see that tactics and courage matter, but they are meaningless without the ability to sustain them. The Japanese admirals who watched the flood of American carriers in 1944 and 1945 understood this too late. Their realization becomes a warning for others. Never enter a prolonged conflict without the means to replace what will inevitably be lost. As the Cold War begins, the U.S. Navy builds a new generation of carriers. These are much larger than the wartime fleet carriers and far beyond the escort carriers in size and capability. The first supercarriers, like the USS Forrestal, carry more planes, heavier weapons, and more advanced technology than anyone had imagined in 1942. Yet their lineage can be traced back to the humble escort carriers. The logistical systems developed to build, supply, and maintain those small ships form the backbone of the modern carrier force. In conflicts after World War II, the influence of the escort carriers remains visible. During the Korean War, small carriers are used again to provide close air support and convoy protection. They no longer carry the name CVE, but their role echoes the work of their predecessors. Even as technology advances, the idea of a flexible, rapidly built ship that can project air power remains valuable. For historians, the escort carriers represent a turning point. They show how innovation can emerge under pressure. When the U.S. Navy first considered them, they were seen as temporary, even second-rate. Some officers doubted their worth. But necessity forced action. The decision to adapt merchant hulls into carriers proved critical. It allowed the Navy to expand quickly, filling gaps that could not be covered by fleet carriers alone. What began as a stopgap became one of the defining features of the Pacific War. The story also includes the millions of workers back home. Without them, the carriers would never have existed. In shipyards across the country, welders, riveters, and machinists worked long hours to meet production goals. Many were women, part of a workforce that changed the nation's social fabric. The image of Rosie the Riveter hammering steel became iconic, but the reality was thousands of anonymous hands shaping the tools of war. Each escort carrier launched was a testament to their labor. Japan's experience tells the other side of the story. As the war dragged on, shortages deepened. Civilians faced hunger and fear. Factories operated under constant bombing and with limited supplies. Even when a new ship was completed, there might not be enough fuel to operate it or enough pilots to fly its planes. By the end of the war, Japan's shipyards were almost silent. This contrast between abundance and scarcity highlights the deeper meaning of the escort carriers. They were not just ships. They were proof of a system that could keep fighting without pause. Modern naval officers study the Battle off Samar, where escort carriers faced the main Japanese fleet and held their ground. They see in that battle the courage of individuals, but also the larger truth of the campaign. The reason those ships were there at all was because the United States could afford to have them in every corner of the Pacific. Strategy and bravery mattered, but behind them was a foundation of production and logistics that never faltered. Today's U.S. Navy supercarriers, massive and complex, dominate the seas in a way no ship has before. They are technological marvels, capable of launching strikes anywhere in the world. Yet their heritage includes the simple, rugged escort carriers of World War II. The lessons learned from those small ships continue to shape how modern carriers are built, supplied, and used. When historians look back, they see that the escort carriers were more than tools of war. They were symbols of a nation's resolve and capacity. They showed that innovation and scale, applied together, could overcome even the strongest enemy. The Japanese admirals who watched the Pacific fill with these ships saw not only their own defeat but also the future of naval warfare taking shape before their eyes. Their quiet recognition, recorded in meeting notes and memoirs, speaks to the enduring impact of those unassuming baby flat tops that changed the course of history.